This is Mika Pikazo, a Japanese illustrator most well known for her unique pop illustration style and works in some small projects such as Fire Emblem and also some indie VTubers. But what intrigues me most about Mika Pikazo was the pop illustration techniques, the halftones, the grains, and other weird wacky effects. How did she do it? What are some of the techniques that she used to create these insane effects? So in this video, I'll be attempting to recreate this illustration from scratch, showing you my journey into uncovering Mika Pikazo's hidden techniques, as well as giving you some insights into her workflow. Well, at least that was the plan. Unfortunately, this study wasn't as smooth sailing as I had hoped. I was so overwhelmed with the amount of details in this image that the first hours that I spent on this, I just couldn't figure anything out. In order to find a reliable workflow, I tested all sorts of techniques and tried all the blend modes, but that just didn't work. I just couldn't figure out why the hair has like 6 colors. What are all these effects stacked on top of each other? And looking at the glasses just felt like staring into the 4th dimension. Feeling lost, I went and bought Mika Pikazo's Pixiv fan box, hoping for some files, but all I got was the rough, and oh look, it's done. I also took the short course on Pixiv Sensei, although very helpful, more on that later. It didn't really help answer these questions that I had, so I considered studying a different, simpler illustration. But since this one was my favorite from Mika Pikazo, I really want to know how it's done. And just then, I realized something. This animation from Mika Pikazo's fanbox was actually the same character but from a different angle. The animation contained the same elements, but everything was much simpler. So realizing that breaking down this image was not happening anytime soon, I thought I would try to understand Mika Pikazo's workflow better by studying this image first and working up to the final boss once I have a better understanding of the workflow. From the Pixiv Sensei course, you can see how many considerations went into each illustration. All the planning, the design, the composition was just incredible to see. So here, I'm going to skip all that and trace the line art. I'll tackle composition techniques in a future video. For Clip Studio users, here's the brushes that Mika Pikazo used. But what I used here in Photoshop was a basic hard round brush, soft brush, and a smudge tool. Simple, but it gets the job done. To understand how Mika Pikazo colors skin better, I looked at this animation of the hands. This is a great reference for the structure of the skin. Here you can clearly see the base color, the shadow, and this saturated line, which I think is subsurface scattering, but I'm not super sure. If you know what this is called, let me know in the comments. So for the skin, after adding the base color, I added the first shadow, then a second darker shadow on top, and lastly, the saturated line. Using the same structure, I did the same thing for the clothes and accessories. I tackled each material one at a time so it wasn't too overwhelming. Judging from the Pixiv Sensei video, I'm guessing that there could be around 4 layers to the hair, which are the base color, lighter shadow, darker shadow, and highlights. So that's what I tried to do here. But for this illustration, swap highlights with a skin-colored glow. This will give the impression that the hair is thinner around the bangs. The pressure opacity brush that I used here was alright, but as you can see, the outcome was nowhere close to the original. But later in this video, I tried using the same brushes that Mika Pikazo used, so stick around to see how those brushes compared to these ones that I'm using. The colors that Mika Pikazo used were all quite saturated, but they worked really well together. That's because these colors are triads, with red being the primary color, minty green as a secondary color, and yellow as the complementary color. If you want to use this kind of super saturated color scheme, be mindful of how much of each color that you're using. To make sure that your colors don't clash, you can follow the 60-30-10 rule. Up until this point, everything was going smoothly, until it was the time to do the glasses. This was the thing that ultimately scared me away from the first illustration. But since this one was much simpler, it helped me realize something that I overlooked. You see, I realized upon closer inspection that the glasses were probably not made up of blend modes, meaning that it's not transparent. Because if it was blend modes, then here you would see the fingers, or here where you would see the accessories. So I believe the lenses was done separately from the hair. So here's how I recreated the glasses. First, add a dark purple color for the shadows. Then add the bright red glow, which was the reflection of the background. Next, using an opacity brush, I added these parallel lines, which could be done in order to show the flow of the hair. And lastly, add the light reflection using linear dodge. It looks a bit crappy right now, but that's because we haven't added the halftone filter. To do this, duplicate and merge the layer. Go to Filter, Pixelate, and Color Halftone. Feel free to play around with the radius and channels, set that to 50% opacity, and draw the last light reflections on top to finish off the glasses. And that looks incredible. Although I was able to somewhat replicate the glasses, I didn't truly understand the fundamentals of how these pink lenses work. I couldn't find any good photographic references for this, so take this process with a grain of salt. And here's my favorite part from this whole study, which was adding halftones to give the image that iconic pop graphic look. Here I'm using halftone brushes from Adobe's Mika Brush Pack, and it wasn't working as well as I had hoped. The main issue was how the edges were super sharp, unlike the originals. Perhaps you could try to soften the edges to fix this issue, or download a better halftone brush. But I had another idea. If I want the most authentic results possible, then maybe I should try using the same software as Mika Pikazo.
今回はクリップスタジオペイントを中心に制作します。
So here we are in Clip Studio Paint. Wait, how do you zoom? To create the halftone / screen tone, first apply the areas that you want halftone with an airbrush. Then click on the tone button to turn the layer into halftones. Adjust the size to your liking, then use clipping mask to change the color. Alternatively, you can also use lock transparent pixels to do this. And this was the outcome of my first attempt. The halftone turned out really well, and I'm really happy with how close it was to the originals. I love how halftone alone was able to give the image that pop graphic look. It's something that Mika Pikazo does a lot, so feel free to give this a try. Not to mention, I was so impressed with Clip Studio Paint. This is something that I had trouble doing in Photoshop, so I was pleasantly surprised by how easy it was to do in Clip Studio Paint. But this also got me thinking, what if there's an even better way of doing this? Perhaps in another software. Krita, Medibang, Procreate, Ibis Paint, Adobe Illustrator, and you know what? Microsoft Paint. Okay, let's stop it there. And all of these aren't too bad at all. Each software has their own ways of doing halftones, which was really fun to explore. My favorites were Clip Studio Paint, Krita, and Procreate, for how easy it was to use and how the results turned out. And don't worry, even if you don't have any of these softwares, you can always use real halftones. With the first study done, I'm now armed with the knowledge to tackle the final boss, which I'll be doing in Clip Studio Paint. Since I started the free trial, I might as well make the most out of it. Also, I can now use the same brushes as Mika Pikazo to get a more authentic result. The brushes were a pencil brush for the line art, G pen, and watercolor brushes for coloring. After I finished tracing the line art, I filled it in with the base color. For the skin, I used the same layer system from the first attempt. I started by adding the lighter shadow, then a darker shadow, and lastly, add in the saturated lines that separate light from shadow. I also use the blend tool quite often to help with softening the edges. This time around, the results for the hair were much closer to the original, thanks to these watercolor brushes. First I added the skin-colored glow, then added the first lighter shadow. And lastly, add the darker shadow on top of everything. I've been praising these brushes quite a lot, but honestly it's nothing too special. Don't feel like you have to use the exact same brushes to get these results. You can definitely find something similar in your preferred software. There were no fancy blend modes for the eye. All I did was, using a G-pen brush, colored in a way that makes the eye look wobbly and chaotic, which looks weird up close, but quite natural when you zoom out. Then for the accessories, it was the same process. Base color, shadow, darker shadows, and white highlights. And again, the layer system that I've been showing so far was just my guess. I have no idea what Mika Pikazo's layers actually look like, but doing it this way makes the coloring process quite simple and straightforward. Once all that's done, we're back to the glasses once again. I used the same layer system as before, with the addition of a few more layers for details. Starting off with a hot pink base color and a dark purple shadow, this time with additional black gradients to give it more depth. Then add the first reflections using linear light blend mode. Then another linear light for a different reflection. Using color dodge, add pink hues to the lens to give it more colors. Next with the streaks to show the flow of the hair. Lastly, to create the halftone effects, I duplicated and merged the layers twice. Change one of the layers into halftone and clip the other layers to it. Then change that layer to pin light blend mode to bring out the halftones. And after all that, finish off the glasses by adding one last solid reflection. And the glasses is done. So this time around, the glasses was all done in Clip Studio Paint, but the one thing that Clip Studio halftone function couldn't do was to replicate the CMYK split effect. In the original, you can see the yellow splitting from the magenta, so later on I will be reapplying halftone in Photoshop to get this exact look. Last thing to do was to add some final details in the form of smoke trails, hair strands, and halftones. I don't think there's a rule when it comes to halftone placements, just play around and see what works for your illustration. And that was all for Clip Studio Paint, and then moved to Photoshop for finishing touches. Here you can see some grainy effects. The way I did this was by adding a gray color. Go to Filter, Add Noise, and setting it to Overlay Blend mode and lowering the opacity. To create a proper CMYK halftone look for the glasses, go to Pixelate and Color Halftone. Here you can clearly see the CMYK effect when compared to the outcomes from Clip Studio Paint. The last and coolest effect to add was this one right here, this weird glassy effect. I did some testing and the closest I got was by using this glass filter in the filter gallery. These were the settings that I used, but feel free to play around. I then blurred and lowered the opacity to make it more subtle. And here's the final outcome of this study. Hopefully some of these techniques were helpful. I really love how just by applying halftones, your image will instantly give off that pop graphic look. Aside from that, Mika Pikazo has many different stylization methods, and in this video I've barely scratched the surface. Not to mention how masterful she was with colors, which was probably what made Mika Pikazo's art so unique. But I didn't touch on it much in this video, simply because I feel like I don't know enough about it at this moment. But hopefully the workflow shown in this video was a good starting point for your own journey. If you have any artists you want to see next, feel free to comment below. And thanks for watching.